James sat in his office, the panoramic view of the city spread out before him. The towering glass buildings reflected the early evening sun, casting long shadows over the streets below. It was a typical scene for someone in his position, a 32-year-old senior analyst at a prestigious investment firm, with everything seemingly in place. The corner office, the polished furniture, the glass desk, they all screamed success. Yet, as he gazed out the window, a tightness in his chest refused to loosen. Something felt off. He had it all. A lucrative career, a stylish apartment in the heart of the city, and a fiancée, Lily, whom he was about to marry. She was beautiful, ambitious, and had all the right qualities. James couldn't count the number of times his colleagues and friends had told him how lucky he was to be with her. She was charming, intelligent, and had a way of making people feel seen, making him feel seen. But recently, something had shifted between them. It wasn't that Lily had changed, or at least, not in any way that was immediately obvious. She was still as stunning as ever, with her radiant smile and confident demeanor. But there was an underlying shift in her, something subtle that James couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't just the way she seemed distracted, or the moments when she'd zone out during their conversations, lost in her own thoughts. It was as though a wall had slowly risen between them, one he couldn't climb over, no matter how hard he tried. They had always been a great match. In the beginning, everything was effortless. Their first dates were filled with laughter and light-hearted conversation. Their weekends were spent exploring the city, cooking dinner together, and dreaming about the future. They talked about getting married, raising kids, and growing old together. Everything felt right, like the universe was perfectly aligning their paths. But somewhere along the way, the connection that once felt so deep had begun to fray at the edges. Their conversations became shorter, their time together less frequent. James found himself working late more often, staying at the office longer, and when he got home, Lily was either out with friends or buried in her phone, scrolling through something that seemed more important than their relationship. She didn't notice when he came in late. She didn't seem to notice much of anything anymore. James dismissed it at first. They were both busy, he told himself. He had a demanding job, and Lily had recently been promoted at her marketing firm. They were both navigating new professional responsibilities. It was normal to feel a little distant, right? Maybe it was just a phase, something temporary. After all, they were planning their wedding, so clearly, they were both invested in their future together. But the nagging feeling in his chest didn't go away. It only grew. He thought he might be imagining things, projecting insecurities onto her. After all, their relationship had been strong for so long. They had weathered the usual ups and downs. But this felt different. It felt deeper. Maybe it was the way Lily no longer looked at him the same way, the way her eyes seemed to dart around the room when he spoke, as if she wasn't fully present. Maybe it was the moments when they'd sit in silence, and he'd feel like a stranger sitting across from her. Whatever it was hard to ignore. One evening, when the unease was almost unbearable, James decided to confront it head-on. He needed to know if he was just being paranoid, or if there was something more going on. It wasn't like him to overthink things, but lately, his thoughts had been spiraling. He took a deep breath, stood up from his desk, and grabbed his jacket. He had a few hours free before meeting clients the next day, and he figured he could spend some time with Lily. It would be the perfect opportunity to reconnect, to break through whatever barrier had formed between them. As he drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The city lights blurred past, reflecting off the wet pavement, but his mind was elsewhere. What if she was bored with him? What if she didn't love him the way she once did? Maybe this was just the natural progression of things, people grew apart over time. But that didn't explain the strange distance he felt. It didn't explain the weight that had settled in his stomach, growing heavier with each passing day. He pulled into the parking garage of their building and took the elevator up to their apartment. The familiar hum of the elevator seemed louder than usual, echoing in the quiet of the evening. James noticed his hands were slightly clammy as he unlocked the door. "Lily," he called out, his voice echoing through the apartment. There was no immediate response. It was eerily quiet. He slipped off his shoes and walked down the hallway, toward the living room. That's when he heard it, a voice, soft but unmistakable, coming from the couch. At first, it sounded like an unfamiliar conversation, but the closer James got, the more his heart began to race. There was no mistaking it, that was Lily's voice, but there was someone else with her. His footsteps faltered as he reached the living room door. He froze. Through the crack in the door, he saw her sitting on the couch, her back to him. A man was next to her. He wasn't just sitting beside her, but his arm was around her, their bodies too close for comfort. James' stomach lurched, the room spinning around him. It was as if everything inside him stopped. The laughter, the intimate tone, it was all too much. For a split second, he wondered if he had walked into the wrong apartment. But no, this was their home. The couch, the coffee table, the framed pictures on the wall, they were all where they belonged. The betrayal hit him like a punch to the gut. He felt his breath catch in his throat, and his hands balled into fists at his sides. Before he could even process what he was seeing, Lily turned her head, her eyes widening in shock when she saw him standing there. The man beside her quickly stood up, his face a mixture of confusion and guilt. James stood frozen, unable to move. 1,000 thoughts flashed through his mind, none of them making sense. The world felt like it was collapsing in on him. "James," Lily whispered, standing up quickly, her voice trembling. "It's not what it looks like." James couldn't find the words. His entire body felt numb. How had this happened? How had everything fallen apart so quickly? He didn't want to hear the explanations. He didn't want to listen to the excuses. Without saying another word, he turned and walked out of the apartment, the door slamming shut behind him with a deafening finality. As he descended the stairs, his mind was a blur of emotions, betrayal, confusion, anger, and an aching emptiness that settled deep within his chest. The woman he had loved, the woman he was about to marry, had lied to him. And now, there was no going back. James couldn't shake the image of Lily sitting so comfortably with another man. The sound of her soft voice mingling with his laugh kept replaying in his head. He had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning in bed, every thought consumed by what he had seen. His heart was still heavy with betrayal, but it was the silence that followed his departure from the apartment that lingered in his mind the most. The absence of words, the things unsaid, the secrets buried between them, suffocated him. He couldn't focus at work. His emails went unanswered, his mind a haze as numbers and graphs swam before his eyes without meaning. His colleagues noticed the change, the distracted glances, the fidgeting, the rare moments of tension that crept into conversations. But no one asked. No one had to. They all assumed it was just another day in the life of a man about to get married. His outward success masked everything. When he did make it back home later that night, the apartment felt colder than usual. The silence hung thick in the air, oppressive and suffocating. The familiar hum of the refrigerator, the slight creak of the floorboards as he moved across the room, everything seemed exaggerated. There was no warmth, no comfort. The life he had built, the future he had been so sure of, felt like a facade, and now it was collapsing under the weight of a single, brutal truth. Lily hadn't tried to call. She hadn't texted. He'd left in such a hurry the night before that he didn't even think to grab his phone. He wondered if she even cared. A part of him wanted answers. He wanted to confront her, demand an explanation, but another part of him, the part that still wanted to believe in the future they'd built, didn't want to hear whatever story she'd spin. He knew it would be a lie, just like everything else had been. He couldn't bring himself to ask questions he was afraid to hear the answers to. Days passed in a blur. He barely saw Lily. When she did text or call, it was always brief. She asked how he was, apologized for the misunderstanding, and promised they'd talk soon. But the words felt empty, hollow, like they were coming from someone he no longer recognized. James would glance at his phone, staring at the messages as if they were some foreign language. Was she really sorry? Did she really care? Or was she just trying to buy time, buying herself more moments to weave a web of lies? He couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The image of Lily with that man wouldn't leave his mind. He didn't even know who he was, a friend? A colleague? A lover? All he knew was that whatever their connection had been, it wasn't just casual. There was an intimacy there, something more than he was willing to admit. And worse, Lily had allowed it. She had let another man into their life, into their home, without a second thought. The hardest part was the sense of betrayal, not just in what he'd seen but in the way Lily had kept it from him. She had lied, and the lies were the deepest wound of all. She hadn't just been unfaithful, she had betrayed their entire relationship, their bond, their trust. It wasn't just about another person, it was about the future they'd planned. It was about the promises they'd made to each other, the ones she'd broken without a hint of remorse. For days, James stayed in a state of limbo. He didn't want to face her, yet he didn't know how to walk away. The thought of letting go of everything, of walking out the door and leaving it all behind, felt like it would break him. Their engagement had been a dream. He had been planning the wedding for months, picking out venues, selecting dresses, arranging the guest list. Their families were already buzzing with excitement, counting down the days to what they thought was the happiest day of James's life. But how could he marry someone who had betrayed him so deeply? The worst part was that Lily had always been so careful, or so he thought. She had always been the one to play the role of the perfect fiancée. She had been kind, loving, supportive, everything he could ever have asked for. But now, James saw her in a completely different light. There had been cracks in their relationship for a while, he just hadn't known how to see them. Small moments of distance, long nights she'd spent away on work trips, odd little remarks she'd made about needing space or time for herself. He had brushed them off as quirks of a busy life, but now they seemed like warning signs he had ignored. He couldn't bring himself to call her yet. His emotions were too raw, too fresh. The thought of confronting her was terrifying, but more terrifying was the idea of what he might learn. What if there were more lies? What if the man on the couch wasn't the only one? His mind spiraled, his chest tightening with every new thought. Could he trust anything she had ever told him? At work, James buried himself in his tasks, finding solace in numbers and financial statements. The precision of it all, the logic, was a brief escape from the chaos swirling in his personal life. But even as he sat through meetings and reviewed reports, a part of him was always elsewhere, haunted by thoughts of Lily, of the man with his arm around her, and the unbearable weight of the truth that had yet to be spoken. He tried to push the thoughts away, but they would return, sharper and more insistent each time. He began to notice the small things, the way she used to call him when she was on her way home from work, but now there was silence. The fact that she didn't ask him about his day anymore. The quiet, almost careless way she now moved through their apartment. It was as if she was no longer invested in the life they had built, or perhaps, she was simply done with him. One night, he couldn't take it any longer. He had to know. He needed to hear it from her. The doubt that had been festering in his mind had grown too large, too consuming. He could no longer sit in the silence, waiting for answers that never came. He called her, his heart pounding in his chest. He barely let it ring twice before she picked up. "James?" Lily's voice was soft, almost guarded. "Where are you?" His voice was hoarse, barely controlled. He didn't recognize it, but it wasn't his usual calm tone. This was the voice of a man who had been betrayed. "We need to talk." Lily hesitated. He could hear the faint sound of rustling, as if she was pacing. James, I don't think now's the right time, now, he interrupted. It's the only time. I'm done pretending. I need the truth, Lily. There was a long silence on the other end. He could hear her breathing, slow and deliberate. And then, finally, she spoke. I'm sorry, James, she said, her voice trembling with something that wasn't quite guilt, more like fear. But there's something I need to tell you. The words hung in the air between them. James braced himself. Whatever she said, he wasn't sure he was ready to hear it, but he knew it was inevitable. The truth would come out, whether he was prepared for it or not. For days, James couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. He felt like he was drowning in a pool of unanswered questions. The man, who was he? How long had this been going on? Was this the real Lily? The woman who had been so perfect, so loving, had turned into a stranger before his very eyes. James couldn't escape the pain. He confronted Lily the following evening, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and despair. I want the truth, Lily. Everything, he demanded. She didn't meet his eyes. It's not that simple, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. His heart raced. How long? A few months, she said quietly, almost too calmly. I didn't want to hurt you. But I needed something more, something you couldn't give me. The words stung. He wanted to scream, to shout, to demand more from her, but he knew he was too broken to do anything but listen. The pain was suffocating. He loved her, and yet he couldn't look at her without feeling disgust. She wasn't the woman he thought she was. The trust they had built, shattered. But even as the weight of betrayal crushed him, something else stirred inside of him. A quiet voice, barely audible, whispered, "You deserve more than this." James tried to leave. He tried to break it off, to walk away from the woman who had promised to love him forever. But Lily wouldn't let him go. She begged, cried, promised that everything would be different. The manipulative way she clung to him, pulling him back into her world of lies, was suffocating. But there was something else he saw in her eyes now, something darker. She wasn't just apologetic. She was terrified. Terrified of losing control. And James realized then that she wasn't just apologizing. She was scared of what would happen if he walked away. If he left her, she would lose everything. His feelings of betrayal deepened. He wasn't her savior. He wasn't her safety net. He was a pawn in a game that had never been about love. The final straw came on a cold winter evening. James walked into their apartment, only to find Lily on the phone with someone. Her voice dropped to a whisper when she saw him, but not before he caught the words, "I don't think he suspects a thing. He still loves me." His hands clenched into fists. This was it. He was done. James packed his things in silence. He didn't need to say anything more. There was nothing left to say. As he left the apartment, the finality of it hit him. The woman he had loved, the woman he had thought was his future, had never truly loved him back. She had used him to fill a void, to maintain an image of perfection that was always fragile, always dependent on the lies she told. The pain was still there, raw and biting, but James knew one thing: he was free. He stood in the hallway, staring at the door that had once been his home, now a symbol of everything he had to walk away from. He didn't regret it. He walked away, not because he didn't care, but because he realized he deserved better. He deserved someone who would love him for who he was, someone who wouldn't manipulate him for their own gain. Looking back at that moment, James understood that it wasn't just about finding someone new, it was about finding himself. About knowing that he didn't need anyone to complete him. He had learned that love, true love, didn't come from expectations or convenience. It came from respect, honesty, and above all, from truth. And though the pain would linger, the lessons would remain. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that apartment months ago. He had shed the old skin of naivety. And in doing so, he had become the man he was always meant to be, someone who would never settle for anything less than the truth.